Well, welcome everybody. Sarah and I are so glad you could all join us. Together in our workshop today, we're going to be looking at how we can help our students to think and start to take charge of their own learning. So just introductions first. My name's Liz Duncombe. I'm the Digital Learning Manager here at Cambridge International. I became interested in self-regulation through my doctoral thesis, and I've worked together with Sarah on a small-scale project where we started to think about how we could help teachers engage their students in self-regulated learning in their classrooms.
And I'm Sarah Talbot-Joyce. I'm an education manager based here in Cambridge, and I work on developing teacher support resources in the area of really effective pedagogy. And I became interested in self-regulation as part of my master's here at Cambridge. And it kind of stemmed from a frustration, really, of seeing my post-16 students, my A-level students, really not being confident with how to use their independent study time, so their free periods, and really wanting a lot of teacher support when it came to directing their own study. And so my investigation was really looking at how I can develop independent, self-confident, self-directed learners. And so we're going to share some of the things that we found from our research across this session. We're also joined by Lucy and Julie, who are helping us moderate this session and are on hand to support as needed. And a few bits of housekeeping before we get properly started. So if you have a pen and paper handy, that would be great to note down any thoughts or questions you have that arise across the session. There'll be opportunity at the end of the hour to ask all your questions. We'll do our absolute best to answer them. So please do make a note, and if there's anything you'd like us to unpick further, please do note those ideas down. With regards to how we're going to be working across this hour, we're going to, for I think the first time, attempt breakout groups. So please do bear with us as we organise the breakout groups. We haven't done this before. If it doesn't work, there is always a plan B, but there'll be an opportunity to work together and share your experiences, which is always such a joyful opportunity, and something that we always love to learn from each other as well. So there'll be opportunity to work in breakouts, but also a chance to think individually. And so there might be periods of silence where we have the opportunity to self-reflect and think, and that's absolutely fine. So don't be worried about the scary silence. And really that we're just so excited to be here and to learn from each other and to really sort of grapple with this idea of self-regulation and what it means for our learners in the classroom. So across this session, there are effectively two objectives. The first one is to know how metacognition fits into this sort of wider ability to self-regulate learning, because I think sometimes there's lots of these sort of terms that get used, but it's quite hard to see how they link together. So we're going to really focus on that. And then also think about how we can, as teachers, encourage a self-regulated approach in our classroom practice. And so, as Liz said, across the session, really, we're going to be drawing on findings from our master's and PhD projects, as well as a project we worked on together. And so we use those findings to really ground this session in classroom practice, think about what we can do as practitioners to really develop self-regulated learning. And we'll be drawing on quotations from students that we spoke to across our projects to really sort of to learn and use their voice to inform our thinking.
Yeah, that's great. So we're actually going to get you to do a little bit of thinking to start with. What we'd like you to reflect on just for a few moments is what you think a self-regulated learner looks like. So we'd like you to make a note of keywords or phrases, just 3 that you think helps to describe that type of learner. What might you see in your classroom? How might they behave? How might they act? And we'll think about this as we go through the session. So just 30 seconds on your own for the moment. So have a think. Sorry, I should have said, if you'd like to share any of those in the chat, that would be fabulous. But if you do want to just make a note for yourself, that's great. Great. Okay, so hopefully you've had a time just for a short think about that. And what Sarah and I thought would be really useful to share with you is actually the sorts of things we were thinking about when we were working on this. Apologies that the author's name is over the quote there. This is work by Barry Zimmerman, and he was an American psychologist who's researched and written really widely on this area. About self-regulated learning and what that actually looks like when learners engage in this process. And we've tried to highlight in bold some of the words that really resonated for us in our research, and what we think is really important, and hopefully what we're going to be thinking about today in this session and helping you to think about how those things might look in your classroom. And as you can see, there's quite a lot going on there. So we've really, as teachers, got to be explicit when we plan in our lessons and think about how we can develop this traits and approaches to learning in our students. And that's what we're going to start to think about as we go through the rest of the session. And thank you for your contribution so far. That's really useful. Thank you.
So that quote from Zimmerman is great, and you can see there's lots of different things a self-regulated learner has to do and they can draw from. But sometimes just seeing it all written down, I can get a bit overwhelmed by, oh my goodness, you know, where do I begin to start, you know, encouraging this approach to learning? So we've got this diagram here, which we've adapted from the Education Endowment Foundation, and we'll be sharing their report later on. And this is a nice way to start to break down what actually a self-regulated learner does. So self-regulation is the wider approach to learning, and that's sort of generally agreed upon in the literature. And a self-regulated learner directs their own learning. They have control over that learning to achieve outcomes that they're happy with. But there's lots of things they need to draw on to direct and control their learning, and so one of the areas is their cognition. So a self-regulated learner has an understanding of the types of thinkings they engage in their subject, as well as an awareness of the subject content itself, as well as an awareness of the different types of learning strategies that they can use to really get to grips with that subject content, and also when those learning strategies are best used for particular tasks. And at the bottom of this diagram, we've just written activities. That's what the teacher can do to influence cognition and develop self-regulated learning in our classrooms. It's through the activities that we do in class. It's through the planning choices that we make for our learners. So that's how we can influence the cognition and the thinking. A self-regulated learner also draws on their metacognitive thinking. So the types of thinking they engage in when they plan, monitor and evaluate their learning. Now, when they're doing the planning, the monitoring and the evaluation of their learning, this has to be embedded within their classroom. So it's done within their subject. It's not an add-on. And as teachers, we can encourage and influence this type of thinking by making our own planning and our own thinking explicit. I mean, we are, in theory, the expert learners, so we should be able to share our expertise by modeling our own thinking, as well as providing opportunities for metacognitive talk through the dialogue and the questions that we ask about learning, and opportunities for focused reflection, all of which is happening within our subject. And it's not a trade-off between the subject content and talking about learning and thinking about learning. The two are very much combined. You can't really have one without the other.
And that's why the last step, motivation, then comes in, because if you're having these sorts of conversations with learners and they're understanding how things are happening in relation to their subject understanding, they become motivated as a result of this, because what they can start to do is take control of their own learning. They gain agency. And what a fabulous feeling that is for learners to think, I'm tackling this thing in history or French or geography or maths, and I've got a range of strategies I can draw upon. I can understand how I can monitor how things are going, and I can see that I'm making progress. So that's fabulously motivational for students. And in addition to that, the Education Endowment Fund that Sarah mentioned has also done some research on this, and students who can begin to self-regulate and work in this manner can actually make up to 9 months progress compared to their additional progress compared to their peers. So a great motivator as well, because students are going to move much more rapidly, much more confidently through their curricula and develop their understanding of each subject as much better as a result. So that's great. But this is all well and good, and this is all quite, you know, abstract at the moment. But what Sarah and I really want to do is bring this back to our classrooms now, and we're going to talk about some of the strategies and activities that we shared with the teachers in our project and the students in the project we worked on. And we'd like, at the end of the session, we're going to provide you with lots of example handouts of the types of materials that we used. So everything that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes and slides, you'll be able to see exemplars of and be able to take those away and edit them and use them in your classrooms too. So we're going to go back to the beginning, and we're going to think about cognition first. And Sarah and I really focused on this in our project together, because it's a really wonderful first step into self-regulation. To be a self-regulated learner, students have to have a broad range of strategies they can choose from. So they're doing an activity and they think, oh, I could use this, I could use that. So we felt that one thing that we could do to support that self-regulation was to provide lots of examples of these strategies, so that they could start to make use of them. The key thing is, like Sarah said, they're not things on their own. They're not things just about thinking. They're linked to the subject matter, but encouraging students to think about what they're doing in that subject matter. So we're just going to talk you through now the key areas of cognitive strategies that you're probably already using in your classroom, but just to make you aware of how they can influence and support self-regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's the real key here, really, is actually, as we talk through this session and the things we can do in the classroom, you will already be doing these things, these activities, you'll already be thinking in this way, but it's just about making our thinking explicit and sharing that with our learners. So when it comes to the different types of learning strategies we can use in our classroom, there are sort of 4 main categories that we can group these strategies into, that we're just going to sort of go through together. So a rehearsal strategy is basically something that exposes a student to material time and time again to help them remember it. So a rehearsal strategy that is quite commonly used in classrooms is using flashcards. Now, flashcards are a really useful way for students to identify what they don't know, so highlight gaps in their knowledge, as well as allowing them to rehearse and practice that material to help them remember it. The next level of these cognitive strategies or learning strategies is adaptation. So these adaptation strategies are those that make a student do something, change the material they're trying to learn in some way to really help them make sense of that material and also to help them remember it. So adaptation strategies might include summarizing a piece of text into its 3 key messages, or it might be taking some material and teaching it to someone else, and by sharing your thinking about that material, by using your own language, you're changing it to help you make sense of it.
And then we move on to organisational strategies. These are probably ones that we're most commonly using in our lessons already. And they're the ones that we set students up to help them organise information and structure their thinking so that they can make links. So a really common example, for example, is a Venn diagram. So you're asking students to organise information into different areas. And finally, what we also need to be thinking about is helping learners to set goals. And really specific goals. For example, when I write my next essay, I'm going to make sure I back up every point I make with evidence, for example. That helps them to focus their planning. It also helps them to identify more easily what strategies they might need to select. So it's really important that we get them into that habit of thinking about their learning, setting a small goal associated with that so that they can go off and be more effective about how they approach that task.
So as teachers, we do this planning when we decide to use an activity in our classrooms, when we decide which strategy to draw from. We know what kinds of thinking that we want our students to engage in. So we know why a flashcard might be particularly useful, or why summarising a text might be good for this particular task. I think this quote highlights perhaps why we need to share our planning and our thinking with our students. So this was someone in my class who, when I asked them, you know, what kinds of strategies do you use, basically said, oh, well, they just all do the same thing, don't they? So he's giving the example of mind maps and flashcards. It's all the same. The learning is the same. And that's really highlighted to me that actually I was doing all the thinking as to why certain strategies were useful, but doing it implicitly myself and not sharing my thinking with my classes. So of course they're not going to pick up on why particular learning strategies are useful for particular tasks, because I'd never shared that with them. And then of course they struggle to then use their study time effectively because they haven't got me directing their learning and giving them options to complete certain tasks and to learn. Definitely. So I thought this was a really nice way to highlight how we need to share our thinking about the strategies that we use.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to do a bit less work, don't we? And
yeah.
encourage them to do more of the thinking, because I think we're very good at that as teachers. We do a lot of that to try and help learners, and actually helping them to think is really what's key. So we're now going to have a go for the first time at a breakout session. We're going to work in small groups, hopefully, until about 25 minutes past. And what we'd like you to think about when you get into your groups are the 4 areas that we've spoken about. So rehearse, adapt, organise and set goals. And what we'd like you to do in your group is to share any examples of activities of these sorts of things that you're already doing in your classrooms. When you get into your breakout groups, you should be able to access your cameras and your microphones. So you should be able to talk to one another at that point. It might be useful because you're not going to be able to see this slide once you get into the breakout rooms, we don't think. You might want to take a snap of this or just jot down the 4 key areas. And then I'm going to ask our lovely moderators in a moment or two if they could push us into the breakout rooms. Just be aware there's no countdown when you come back in, so it's rather abrupt. So bear with us. But yes, let's try and go into our breakout room sessions now. Hello, everybody. I'm hoping you've all returned from the breakout rooms. Smashing. Thank you ever so much. Somebody said now I can hear. So hopefully you've had some time now to think about and discuss in your groups what that cognition, what that thinking around separated regulated learning looks like in the classroom. So what we're going to do now is move on to the next step, which is metacognition. Again, what that might look like with our learners in our classrooms. And it's really important that we link cognition and metacognition. And both Sarah and I found the diagram we're going to share with you next really, really useful way to help us think about this. And again, you're going to get the link to this material in the materials that we send you after the session. So once again, though, it's really important that when we think about metacognition, that we make this explicit to our learners. You know, we're really good at teachers at doing this and thinking about this, but it's making it explicit. So it's important to see how the two link together. So when you're engaging in cognition, you know, you're thinking about things like planning, you're getting ready to approach an activity. So you're thinking about what you might have done in previous experiences and choosing a strategy from that, hopefully that bank of things that you've got at your disposal. And then, of course, you move through the strategy, and all the time, if you're a good self-regulated learner, you'll be monitoring what you're doing, how things are going. Am I making progress towards my aim? Have I answered the key question, or whatever the task is asking me to do? But also, underneath that, as well as thinking about how you're getting through the content, has the strategy I've actually chosen working for me? If it's not, what might I need to change? Might I need to adapt what I'm doing? And then finally, a self-regulated learner is always going to be evaluating all the time. That really pushes them into that metacognitive side of their thinking. Okay, I've learned this, but actually I still don't understand that bit very well, or that was really tricky and I need to change the way I do that next time because actually that stopped me progressing. So there's lots and lots of things we can be doing around this in our classroom. And as a teacher, questioning and using question stems like the ones we've got on the screen here really help to make that thinking visible. And when you've been planning in your lesson and deciding what strategies you're going to be using, explaining that to your students and making that really clear. So they get into the habit of listening to you talking about learning. And as the expert, you can really share that with your learners. So what Sarah's going to share with you now is some exemplification of what we used in our project to help get that link between the cognitive, the strategy, and the metacognitive, you know, the evaluating and thinking about how that strategy is working.
So Liz and I developed these handouts that could be used in class, given to your students that they can then work from. And just this is going to be part of the pack that we send through towards the end. So again, you can use these handouts and adapt them as you see fit. And really what we did was to try and make our planning explicit and share that with our learners via these resources that we made. Really, these are double-sided handouts, and on the front you can see here we've got what the strategy is. So we chose elaborative interrogation. It's an adaptation strategy, and we started to break down, okay, well, why and how can we best use this, so learners can start to think about in future, independently, if they were to use this strategy again, you know, when would it be best to do so. So we're trying to integrate this planning talk into our handouts, and we sort of had different sections. So we've got a section explaining, first of all, to the students what elaborative interrogation actually is. It's effectively asking them to question the material that they're engaging with, asking kind of why and how questions, and then they try and answer those. So they're adapting and they're changing that material. So they're not simply reading it. We've then got a little example to demonstrate what a good one looks like effectively. So that's in the box, that's the second arrow. So they can help, it helps them monitor their progress. So when they're trying this strategy themselves, you know, does it actually look like how what I'm trying to achieve? Am I on the right track? So it helps with their monitoring. And the last section, why use it? So what is this actually good for? Why is it a useful strategy to use? And it's this sort of the planning talk that we've integrated into these worksheets that students have at their disposal. And this is the metacognitive talk and the metacognitive thinking that we've got sort of demonstrated here in these handouts that actually elevates this strategy. It's not just a strategy anymore. They're also starting to think about, well, how is it helping me learn? When can I best use this? And perhaps will I want to change it in the future if I was to use this strategy again? So it's sort of really linking that cognition, the strategy, to the metacognition, to thinking about the strategy and the learning.
Yeah. And then on the reverse, so as Sarah mentioned, these are double-sided handouts. On the reverse was an in-depth subject example of the strategy actually being used. And it was really important for us to develop this, because a part of our project was to allow students to go off and use these materials independently. So it was really important that they could see a fully worked example, so that they could, like Sarah said, monitor their own progress when they start to have a go at this on their own. And also, it's really important with all of these thinking strategies is that they are fully integrated with the subject that you're teaching. So they're not just these standalone things, but they're actually grounded in the subject content that you're trying to share and get students to understand about. So again, this is helping them get into that metacognitive mode of thinking. So the key thing here is, though, that what we found and what we found through our research is that you engage with these materials with your students in the classroom first, so that they really start to get to grips with these, and also ask any questions that they might have about how the strategy, why it's useful and that sort of thing, before they can then go off and do these things independently. So that's really key, and that's why the subject example is so important, because you're helping them rehearse and use the strategy.
So we can always sort of take it a step further with developing this sort of the metacognitive thinking in our classrooms. So we've got sort of the making our planning explicit, but we can also through the questions that we ask students, get them to reflect on the learning once they've completed a particular activity or strategy. And we've called them debriefs, these sort of reflective questions that get them thinking about their learning. And so it's kind of quite a nice wraparound. You sort of got, you know, sharing your planning beforehand, like why are we doing these particular tasks? What's the learning that comes from them? And then sort of this debrief once we've actually completed them together as a class. Now, the questions we've got on the slide are some examples of the kinds of debrief questions you might do after an activity to get students reflecting on their learning. And they link to the metacognitive phases of planning, monitoring, and reflection. And so these are really useful questions to ask, and it gives you the opportunity to hear from your learners and start engaging them in a dialogue about their learning, which for a lot of students is quite new. And so structured questions like this are quite a useful starting point to get them thinking about what have I actually just done in the last 20 minutes? How have I learned, as well as what have I learned? The more students engage in these kinds of questions about their learning, the more confident they come, and the more they're able to make informed decisions about the direction of learning they want to take in the future. So, for example, if elaborative interrogation wasn't a useful strategy for them and they could say exactly why, that might not be something they do in the future, but they can select something else to complete a task. And when I was introducing the debrief reflective questions with my students, I mean, it was quite difficult at first to actually get them sort of talking about their learning. They were very confident talking about history as the subject and the topics that we were covering, but not necessarily about how they approached the learning of history. And so I was struck quite early on how my students struggled to find the right words to articulate their learning. They didn't know when they completed a visual organizer, for example, what their starting point was. And so that struck me as interesting, but also, of course, I've never asked them about their learning in this way. Of course, they didn't have the words for it, but my advice is don't give up with debriefing them and asking them to reflect on their learning, because just a second round of asking them some debrief questions, we could already see confidence starting to increase, and they're able to share their ideas about their learning that bit more. I think the opportunity to talk with their peers as well is always useful, and to hear what they say about what they find challenging and how they overcome those challenges. So I think that was quite a useful thing. So don't give up. It might be a bit difficult at first to get them finding the right words to talk about their learning, but it's such an important thing to do.
Definitely.
And just to say, here's some of the student quotes I got when asking them to debrief. So this was after we did use a visual organizer to help organize our thinking in preparation for writing an essay. And so this student said, well, actually, it was quite useful because it sort of showed me what I didn't know. Well, there we go. He has highlighted what he doesn't know, and he can start to direct his learning to fill those gaps in his knowledge. So that was quite lovely to hear. I think because these debrief questions are grounded within your subject, there's no compromising on time. It's not a trade-off between developing metacognitive thinking and developing subject knowledge. Well, it's actually both happening at the same time. And I think for me as a teacher, engaging in these sort of discussions about learning helped me reveal learner habits. It showed me areas for development and areas of where they're successful, and so it helped me inform my future planning as well, with regards to sort of where to go in history. And there's another quotation as part of this debrief after using a visual organizer, that actually before this this student wasn't thinking like a historian, and that was really interesting. That asking these questions about how he approached a strategy got me sort of reflecting on, well, you're not approaching the subject like a historian. Sort of knowledge was very separate. He didn't see how it linked. Well, if he can't see how it links, he's not going to understand things such as cause and consequence, significance, the ability to evaluate in history. So I think it just sort of reiterates that point, that it's really useful for informing your planning, and it's not one or the other. Metacognition and cognition happen at the same time.
No, they're not exclusive, are they, at all? Great. So what we're going to do is once again ask you now to have a quick discussion in your breakout groups again. What we'd like you to do is pick one learning strategy that you use already in your classroom that you're really familiar with, and we've got a couple of examples there that you might use. We'd like you now to think about what you might say to your class next time you use that strategy with them, to help them think about why they're using it as a cognitive thing. You know, why do we want to think like this and learn like this? And then also, what does a good one look like, and how might we go about building up a good one? And then, like Sarah was saying, how might you then debrief them afterwards? What sorts of questions might you ask them to reveal their understanding about what they've just done, and why it was useful and why it worked and why it may not have worked for them? So we're going to give you just 7 minutes, so a really super quick chat, and I'm going to stop now so that you can go off into your breakout rooms. Thank you. Hi everyone, just checking. Could somebody just pop us a message just to see if you're back from your breakouts? Yes, super. Thank you ever so much, everybody. Great. So hopefully you've had now a little bit of time just to think about your own classrooms and what might be going on in there to help engage in this cognitive, metacognitive thinking. And the final step in all of this, excuse me, is motivation. And I think this is key because student motivation in particular, as we know, is supported by feedback and evidence to show how they're progressing. So in the early stages of self-regulation development, like Sarah said, you know, many students won't have talked about their learning like this or even thought about what they're doing in subjects like this. So your support and your feedback and your guidance is going to be really crucial into helping them understand and get used to and get practicing these things so they become confident and well versed in a range of cognitive strategies and thinking about how those strategies help them to learn. So at this stage, motivation is not going to be sort of the self-perpetuating thing we were discussing earlier, but actually supported by you, which will then hopefully lead on to really well motivated learners because they've got a range of things at their fingertips that they can go away and try when they're working on their own or working in your classroom, and they understand why they're doing these things and how they're going to help. And we've got another quote here from another student that we work with, and this just demonstrates even after just one or two opportunities to engage with these sorts of things, that familiarity starts to help build that motivation and that understanding of what they're doing and why. So I think that's really key, is just to stick with it. It's not going to happen immediately. Students need time to develop these strategies, particularly if it's not something that they're used to doing, and also time to develop that language of learning with you. And that's really key because it's hard work thinking about these things if you're not used to doing it and you don't really have the vocabulary to do that because you've not been engaged in these sorts of conversations before. So, you know, I think that is our absolute key message, is to stick with it. You'll see the results, but it will take a little bit of time for you and your students to, you know, to get used to these slightly different discussions. So sort of leading on from this and sort of now going to slightly more practical side of things, part of our project that Sarah and I engaged with our one of our local schools was to think about how we could support this self-regulated learning at home by using online resources. So the materials that we're going to provide to you in your pack, we provided to the teachers and students we were working with so they could use them in their classroom. And then they were also provided to those students online through the school's LMS, so that having done these things in the classroom, having talked about these things and talked about the strategies, teachers can either recommend some strategies for students to go away and do. So for homework, you need to do these things. Therefore, you might want to try this strategy and it's available for you online. But what it also starts to do is, if you want to start to reinforce these ideas and even develop a school-wide language, which is obviously the perfect thing, everybody in school talking and thinking about learning the same way, you can start to share this with your colleagues. You can start to explain to students, okay, well, I know you did this strategy in history last week. Why don't we also try this in geography, because it's going to help you think about geography in this way. So I think not only using these in the classroom, but maybe if you can think about sharing them online, sharing them with your colleagues, and starting to develop that wider language for learning and that familiarity for students, I think is really, really positive. So we definitely provided these online, and that might be something you would like to do too, once you've had the materials that we're going to send you at the end.
Okay, well, we're sort of kind of drawing to a close now, really, with regards to sort of new content for this session, but we thought it'd be quite interesting now just to take 30 seconds, again, individually, just to think, well, has our thinking about what a self-regulated learner is has that changed? So just over the next 30 seconds, have a think, and are there any sort of additional words that you would like to share that you think best describe a self-regulated learner? And if you just share those words in the chat, and we'll just have a look and see sort of yeah, what you're coming up with and perhaps what's changed. Just 30 seconds.
Yeah, these are fabulous. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Scaffolding, time management, and yet still reflection. Yeah. Elaborative interrogation, aware of that strategy and when and how to best use it. Determined, self-awareness. Absolutely.
That's key. Yeah. Self-awareness.
Yeah, the ultimate goal that the student can be independent of the teacher. That's what we want, isn't it?
Yeah.
To have learners who can direct and control their learning. Absolutely brilliant.
Super.
Opportunities for reflection, absolutely key, embedded within your subject.
Yeah, experience is great. Fab.
Wonderful. Gosh, yeah, absolutely. Drawing on cognition and metacognition, as well as controlling their motivation. Know their purpose. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Gosh,
great.
Wonderful.
Okay, well, we're gonna just wrap up with a few final thoughts there.
So yeah, absolutely. A self-regulated learner, or self-regulated learning, sorry, requires students just to have a wealth of understanding to draw on at the appropriate time. So they need to know about their subject and how they best learn in their subject, and the tools or strategies at their disposal to best use, as well as understanding, you know, how they can then start to think about their planning and monitoring of how they're progressing in their subject, and evaluating the learning that takes place, as well as controlling their motivation. And you know, if things aren't going particularly well, finding that resilience to pick themselves up. So they draw on all of these things. And as teachers, we can begin to influence this thinking by doing a couple of quite straightforward things in the classroom, making our thinking explicit. With regards to why are we doing particular activities, how are these strategies helping you think about history or maths or science in this particular way? So really sharing our expert sort of learner planning with our students, so it's not implicit and they're sort of used to hearing us talk about our learning and our thinking in this way. We can also remember to build in that debrief. And I think that was a lovely comment. Someone said use a debrief as an exit ticket. Well, that's wonderful. Absolutely. You know, those reflective questions that were on those slides linked to their metacognitive phases, just allowing them to engage in their thinking and to talk about their learning. And it's just, the point is never done at the expense of content. You know, you will learn so much about their habits and what, you know, their successes, as well as areas they find challenging, by these debriefing questions. And it hopefully gets quicker and easier as they get more and more used to talking about their learning in this way.
And I think we've said this over and over again, but you're already doing all these things as teachers. You're already thinking like this. So it's explaining that thinking to your students. So try and start early. You know, if you want self-regulation to be, you know, I was particularly interested, for example, in my research about how students make the transition from GCSE to A-level. You know, and thinking about self-regulation at that point is too late. You know, we want to be starting them back 3, 4, even in upper secondary and primary. You know, we can all be generating those self-regulative learners by talking about learning really explicitly in our classrooms and just giving it a go. You know, choose a strategy that we've spoken about today. Choose one from the pack that you're going to get. Change it around so it suits your subject, because just to make you aware, they're all for geography, because the group classes we work with at the school were geography classes. So make some tweaks, change it for your subjects. Read the teacher summary in there to really get your head around this, and just have a go, and be prepared to do these things several times before you and your students really get into the swing of it. But you'll really see such a difference. And you know, the students I spoke to, they'd had that sort of support earlier. I know their experience of moving into A-levels would have been so much better and so much more positive for many of them. So I think I feel really strongly that this is super important, and really supports our learners, and also as teachers, you know, makes us more efficient, because we can have really, really high quality conversations about our subjects with our learners, and they can go off and be independent and think really deeply, which is what we want for everybody, isn't it, in our classrooms. So we're going to wrap up there and stop talking at you for a little while. If you have any questions, I think you can now share those in the chat, and one of our lovely moderators will help us at this point. So please feel free to ask any questions now in the last few minutes.
question.
Okay, so we've got a question about students with special educational needs, and I think the key with this is you're an expert already in the needs of that learner. So I think it's about providing accessible conversations. So thinking about the questions you can ask, is that something that they can engage with? Is it the sort of question they're used to? You know, start from a common point where you know your student is confident and well versed, and move on from there. And perhaps for them, they might need a little bit more support with the resources that you provide to really help them understand. And for example, they might need to work with you on these strategies much more than perhaps a student without those particular needs. So I think it's just about being flexible, about thinking about the sorts of questions you already ask and use in your lessons and how they work, and thinking about how you can then use similar types of questions to get them starting to thinking about their learning. And like I say, be prepared for them. It just might take them a little bit longer and a few more times working things through with you and asking different questions. But I think that's key for them. Thank you. That's a great question. Okay, well, thank you ever so much, everybody. It's been wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you all, and I hope you had some great conversations in your groups. We really, really hope that the materials you're going to get help you to engage in your classrooms. Oh, hang on, we've just got one last question, I think. To what extent does the school play the role to value the self-regulated learning? That is the ideal. If you can get this across your whole school, fabulous. Having said that, Sarah's master's research was with her own history classes, and our group project that we did together was with a small group of geography classes. You can start the steps in your own lessons. You can have those fabulous conversations with your students in your classroom. If you can get other colleagues to join you, great, but don't let that put you off if you want to do this in your classroom. Okay. Do you want to do the exit slip?
Oh,
Sarah?
yes, we've got a question. Can the exit slip or other visible thinking tools be considered as a debrief? Oh, that's a good question. Yes, depending on the nature of the questions, really. So the debrief questions are focused on the learning that's taken place. So it's really tapping into students, they're thinking about their thinking. So as long as the tool, the questions you use are really looking at how students plan their learning, how they monitor their learning, and how they evaluate, so those metacognitive phases, that yes, I suppose that the vehicle within which you use for the debrief, that can be flexible, but the focus isn't on the subject content as such, it's on how they've approached and grappled content and how they've learned it.
And you could use some of the debrief questions that actually Sarah shared with you on the slide.
Oh, definitely.
And you can adapt those and maybe ask specifically about what you've been doing in the class associated with those. So use those, take those examples and adapt them. Yeah, great. Yeah, and sorry, we've been getting some feedback that the breakouts were quite quiet. So thanks for the feedback there. We'll take that back, and yeah, it was a great. Hopefully you did have some chats, but we'll work on those. So thank you for bearing with us if your session was a little bit quiet. But yeah, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll call it there. Super. Enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.